Hello everyone, Bob Believes Around the World, and we're back with Unmasking the Edomites with part 2. Now, part 2 is going to be nowhere near as long as the big original Unmasking the Edomites lesson. And what we're mainly going to be covering in part 2 is the Hebrew Edomite Hamite connection. Because although we did talk about Esau's connection with Hamites in the big Unmasking the Edomites lesson, we did not go that deep, and we're going to be going way deeper into the ties that the Hebrew Edomites have with the sons and daughters of Ham, because it's very important to know, and it completely crushes the satanic devil doctrine of Esau being the so-called white man. Another devil doctrine that we're going to be crushing today is the Esau got whited out doctrine. Now, there's a doctrine that is pushed by the 1948 people, and what they like to allude to or say is that the Jews look the way that they look today because of all of their time in Europe. So basically what they're saying is that the Israelites got scattered into Europe and got whited out by the sons and daughters of Japhet, and now they look identical to the sons and daughters of Japhet today because of all the time they spent in Europe. But that is false for many reasons. For starters, all of the Israelites did not get scattered into Europe. As we've covered, there were different Israelites who were scattered into European countries, but unlike the story that the 1948 people tells, all of us didn't go there. We have Israelites who got scattered in Japan. We got Israelites that got scattered into India, America, Latin America, some parts of Africa. So although, the scripture tells us we'd be led captive, into all nations, scattered to the four corners of the earth, we have Israelites who scattered into Europe, but all of us didn't go there. Another thing that's false about that whited out doctrine of Israel is the Israelites were still being described by the Europeans as being swarthy in Europe. And you have ancient depictions of Negroes living among Japhetic Caucasoid types in Europe. So the Israelites were still black in Europe, and they were black when they were exiled and kicked out by Japhet. So we never turned, our Israelite brethren who were scattered into Europe never turned white. And that's what we're going to be exposing with the Esau's the white man doctrine, because I'm very familiar with this teaching. Because when the Most High Yah first brought me out of the bondage that is One West Camp doctrine, I saw a lot of stuff of people saying that Esau is the Arabs. Now, Esau is an Arab. The Hebrew Edomites are Arabs. But here's the thing, though. You can't say the Arabs. There's multiple different types of Arabs. You have Hebrew Edomite Arabs. You have Hebrew Ishmaelite Arabs. Both of these are Negroes, as we're going to see today, and as we've already seen many times before. And then you have the Japhetic Caucasoid ones, Japheth shall dwell in the tents of Shem today, that are in the land. And we're basically going to be exposing how the treatment that Esau's been receiving is very similar to what Jacob has been receiving with the whited out in Europe doctrine. And we're going to be showing how it's twisting scripture to say that Esau was whited out by the Greeks. Esau didn't turn white. He's still Negro today. And the Greeks, Japhet, they're still their own people. And Esau is still his own people. Let's get started. So the debate is, was Esau whited out or was he replaced? And we're going to be showing and bringing out the truth in this lesson that Esau was not whited out. Esau has not become the Caucasian Arab, but rather he was replaced. Because we have the Hebrew Edomites on the right, who, as we can see, are reddish, brown, black men. And then we have the modern Arab to the left. Now, we're going to be diving into the DNA, and we're going to be going into the book of Jasher to show that Jasher does not prove that Esau got whited out by Japhet. And we're also going to be going into the African connection and showing everybody that Esau has had a consistent tie with the Hamites. And we're also going to go into the ancient depictions and history and show that the whited out Edomite doctrine makes no sense when you use historical timelines. Let's get started. Now, we've mentioned it before on the channel that Esau built his nation off of African women twice. His first two wives, Esau himself, were Hittite wives. And we're going to take a look at some ancient depictions of the Canaanites, and we're going to see that the Canaanites were not white, they were not albino Africans, they were flat-nosed, dark-skinned people, okay? So Esau, in the beginning, built the nation of Edom off of the backs of Hamitic, flat-nosed black people, okay? That was the beginning. Now, King David later on would nearly completely ethnic cleanse the Hebrew Edomite male population. And Hadad and a few of his servants fled into Egypt. And this is where Hadad married an Egyptian woman, restarting the Edomite lineage. So now we now know that the Edomites have used Hamites twice to build their nation. First in the beginning, and then in the rebuild after David killed all of the men except for Hadad and his few servants. But look what Herodotus had to say about the Egyptians. He said they had thick lips, broad noses, woolly hair, and they are burnt of skin. So once again, the Edomites are using Africans, black people, to build their nation. Now let's look at what the Canaanites actually look like, because we know that the ancient Egyptians were actually swarthy Hamitic peoples. They were not white. They were not Caucasoid Japhet types in any shape, fashion, or form. Now let's look at the beginning of Esau. Now that we have this source right here about Esau marrying black Egyptian woman to get his lineage restarted. Now we are going to be exposing the truth about the Canaanites. The Canaanites are swarthy skinned with African features. The Canaanites weren't albino Africans, nor did they have Caucasian features. Okay, so let's look at these ancient depictions of Canaanites made by the Egyptians. Let's specifically look at the Hittite first, because this is the tribe, the nation of Canaanites that Esau married, the Hittites. Look at its features. See that flat nose? That's a Negro nose. You can also kind of vaguely, faintly make out thick lips. This is not a Caucasian. So, based on the ancient evidence from the Egyptians, we know that the Canaanites were black, just like all of the other Hamites. They weren't some weird, white, Caucasian, Japheth-looking something. They were black. And let's look over at some of the other Canaanites. This is a Philistine. This is not a white man. And you can see the dark skin on him. Here we have an Amorite. So we have three ancient depictions from the ancient Egyptians of the Canaanites, and they're all black. Now let's look at the modern Africans. See how similar they look? They have the same noses, same lips. So nothing has changed from the ancient biblical Hamites, specifically of the Canaanite lineage, to the modern ones of the land. So when you were reading about Esau's Hittite wives, this is the picture that you need in your head, because this is what he had. He didn't have a Japhetic white woman. He had this. And she was not albino white neither. All right? So now it's starting to put a hole. Not only is this crushing the devil doctrine of Esau being the white man, but now it's showing us that in 2 points of Edomite history, they were intermarrying with the people with the darkest complexion on the planet, the Hamites. So how did they get whited out when two Edomites, Esau, the founder of Edom, and his later descendant Hadad, chose to build their nation off of the backs of the people with the darkest complexion on the earth? You see, it makes no sense. Okay, we are now going to be reading the infamous Jasher chapter 90. Now, this is where people go to say that Esau intermarried with the Greeks and became the white man, or specifically the Turkish Arab. But I was going to be reading in Joshua chapter 90, intermarriage or becoming one seed is not mentioned anywhere in this book. Let's get going. Let's start right here where they start in verse 9. Joshua chapter 90, verse 9. And from that time, they could no more lift up their heads, and their kingdom became one with the children of Kittim. And Anbis placed officers in Edom, and all of the children of Edom became subject and tributary to Anbis. And Anbis turned back to his own land, Kittim. And when he returned, he renewed his government and built for himself a spacious and fortified palace for a royal residence, and reigned securely over the children of Kittim and over Edom. Okay, so what's happening here? So we've already discussed one kingdom does not mean one seed that became one nationality, one bloodline. It doesn't mean that. The Israelites were made one kingdom under their oppressors multiple times in history. We're under one kingdom with the Japhethite America white man right now, but yet we are still our own seed. When you do the DNA, we are still our own historic bloodline. We are still our own people, and we do not resemble the Japhetic Caucasian, despite us being in one kingdom, the United States of America, with the Japhite. So one kingdom does not mean one so-called race, one so-called bloodline, and you definitely don't see the word intermarriage listed here. You don't see that, they mingled. You don't see that here. You don't see mingled, you don't see intermarriage. It's not on the page. So that's adding to the word, which is a really dangerous thing to do. And a good analogy of when we talk about the sons of Kittim ruling over the Edomites, what's this really like? A good example of this is how the United States of America overthrew Hawaii. Hawaii was not always a state, and Hawaii had its own indigenous people there long before the Japhetic white man showed up. But yet the Hawaiians are still their own people. The Hawaiians still exist. They can't lift up their head no more because the Japhethite U.S. government is ruling over them. They're no longer their own independent country, but they're still their own independent tribe of people. They're still their own nation. The Hawaiians didn't cease to exist as independent people because they have a new government now over them. So the Edomites had a Japhetic Greek government over them. It doesn't say that they ceased to exist and that they became Japheth and Japheth became Edom. It doesn't say that. Now let's get into some more evidence. So another reason we know that the Turkish Saudi Arabians, or this Turkish Arabs in general, are not the indigenous Ishmaelites and Edomites is because of the DNA. Now, Esau, being the twin brother of Jacob, we've covered this many times before, would come from the same haplogroup as Jacob, as the Israelites, because the haplogroup is passed down from the father unto all the children. So Esau will always be a genetic match to Jacob. You're not going to have somebody who's Esau who has absolutely no genetic match to the Israelites whatsoever. And when we look at the majority of the haplogroups of the modern Saudi Arabians, 71% comes from the J1 haplogroup. The J1 haplogroup is a Caucasoid Japhetic Turkish haplogroup, and it is not related to the E1B1A that is carried by the descendants of Jacob, the Israelites. And remember what Obadiah said? The Most High Yah said that he would make that Edom was small among the heathen and greatly despised. So remember that small among the heathen part, because that part Obadiah is true today and has come to pass. Because when we look at the DNA, there are a group of people in Saudi Arabia that have a perfect genetic match to the Israelites. But look how small of the population they are. That sky blue, that's them, versus Japheth, the 71%. So we've already discovered that the Jasher does not say that they became one seed, that became one people, that Esau became white. It doesn't say that. And the DNA debunks that, because for the Japhetic Caucasoid Arab to be Esau, this 71% J1 would have to be 71% E1B1A for them to have the connection to Jacob that they would need, okay? Because you're never going to have Edomites that aren't related to Israelites, all right? Now, let's move on. Another haplogroup that's in Saudi Arabia today as well that I'd like to talk about that has the genetic connection to the Israelites that would be needed for them to be Esau is not only the E1B1A, but the E1B1B11. That is a haplogroup that is closely related to the haplogroup that is carried by the Israelites. So we have two haplogroups in Saudi Arabia today that match, that are a genetic match to the Israelites, and therefore a genetic match to being Edomites or Ishmaelites, because remember, Ishmael's family as well. And both of these haplogroups are the minority. Remember, Esau is small among the heathen. So now, and when you look into the population of the Turkish Arabs, you start to realize how saying that they're Esau starts to go against scripture in another way. Because the scripture tells us that Esau is small. Okay? He's a small nation of people. He's not big. And when you look at the Arabs around the world today, they are big in number. They've been enlarged. And you realize the ones that are everywhere that you can't seem to get away from are the Japhetic Caucasoid ones. You know, the majority of the people in the Middle East are these white Arabs. You go to Europe and their immigration crisis, as what they're calling it, and the Arabs who are busting down the doors of European immigration are these Turkish Japhetic ones. You look in Detroit and the Michigan area, was it Dearborn, Michigan? And you look at the Arabs up there, and they are the Turkish Japhet ones. So these Arabs that are huge in number, that are all over the world, are these Turkish ones. Not the Edomite and not the Ishmaelite ones, who are the black ones. Here's another set of DNA analysis. We're going into another one. And right here we have the EM35, which is the E1B1B1, which is closely related to the genetic Israelites, the blood of the Israelites. It's a close match, very close. They're related. And we have the J1, Japhetic haplogroup, which is 81% of the population. So once again, Esau is not the majority. And scripture already tells us that. Another thing I want to talk about is, what do children who are half Hebrew and half Japhethite actually look like? Because a lot of people don't actually know how marrying a woman of another nation actually works in terms of what the children will look like. Because a lot of us are under the impression that when you have a child with a daughter of Japhet or a son of Japhet, that they're going to come out looking like Princess Peach and Steve Rogers from the Avengers. But this is what half Hebrew and half Japhethite people look like. As you can see, you can clearly tell that they are black. Look at her hair, look at her wide nose, look at her lips, even face, face build. And look at this man. No one's confusing him for a Japhethite Gomerite. No one's confusing him to be Gomer. No one's confusing him to be Magog. So, Negro features, lighter tone of brown, and colored eyes. So, if we were to assume, we're adding now, because the book of Joshua doesn't say it, that some Edomites married some Kittimites, this is what we're looking at. So now you would have to assume that Esau just kept doing it over and over again for hundreds of years, and lost interest in Africans and lost interest in marrying within themselves. So now you have to assume, because intermarrying looks like this. For you to get the Princess Peach, Steve Rogers result that you need for the doctrine to work, you have to assume that the Negro, whichever Negro people you're talking about, intermarried with Japhet like 10 times in a row, if not more. Because we read in a source a while ago that there was some source I read, I might not have brought it out on the channel, where it talked about how the Negroes are hard to be washed away, meaning that it's hard to fade Negro features, but it's easy to turn a Japhetic population black. It's not easy to turn a black population Japhetic. And as you can see, this is the result. Now we're going to put another bullet hole in this Esau turned into white Arabs doctrine, the doctrine that Esau turned Caucasoid, all right? So the book of Jasher, specifically Jasher chapter 90, takes place under the timeline of the Old Testament. Why do I bring this up? Because the ancient depictions made by the Romans of Herod's family, Herod being Edomite, were made under the New Testament timeline. Herod and his family lived during the New Testament. And Jasher chapter 90 takes place under the historical timeline of the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, the Edomites are still being shown as Negroes. So this shows that Kittim did not turn Esau white, because Kittim overthrew Esau in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, the Edomites are still black. So we know they didn't turn white because hundreds upon hundreds of years later, when we reach the New Testament, the time of the Messiah, the Edomites are still black people. And that's been hundreds of years after the Kittim incident. So they didn't turn white. So the ancient depictions show that Esau did not become the so-called white man. He didn't become the white Arab, more specifically, because he was black in the Old Testament, where the Jasher chapter 90 takes place. And when we see the Edomites again in the New Testament, they're still black. Okay, right here we have a cartoon chart I made a while ago. It's the daughters of Japheth and not the sons of Japheth, but it's good enough to show what I need to show right here. So, sons and daughters of the covenant of Yah, brought this up in a lesson you did a while ago. And it's actually very unlikely that the Kittimites and Javanites were as pale as the northern Japhet types. Because as we've covered on the channel before, Japhet has a wide range of skin tones. You have the pale blue eyes, blonde-haired Japhets of the Gomerites and the Magogites, but then you have the swarthy Indians. So not all Japhites, even though they all have a blood connection and they all have similar features, they're not all so-called white. And it's actually up for debate if the Greeks even looked like these two, because it's very likely that they looked more like the Indian and the Latino, all right? Because Southern Europeans are already darker than Northern Europeans, and there's actually been a lot of whitewashing of the Greeks in history during the Renaissance. So not only all that we've already covered in this lesson, but it's very likely that the type of Japhet, which it doesn't even say intermarriage, but let's say it did, the type of Japhet that would have been marrying Esau would have looked like these two and not these two. So if that's the case, then you have Negro brown mixing with Caucasian brown. You don't have these people, all right?